Welcome everybody to the British Society of Soil Science webinar. I'm Jack Canham and I'm current president of the Society, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our 5th webinar of this year. So before I welcome our presenters, I'd just like to introduce the British Society of Soil Science as hosts of today's webinar. We're an established membership organisation with members across the globe as well as within Britain, and we're a charity that's committed to the study of soil in its widest aspects. So we bring together people working in academia, and we have a growing membership amongst sort of practitioners who are implementing soil science in industry and consultancy. And of course we welcome anybody who has a keen interest in soils to join our membership as well. We'll be hosting 8 webinars in total in 2023, so do keep an eye out on our website for further details of upcoming webinars during the rest of the year. Just before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. There are lots of you here today, so we've just muted your microphones, and we'll be taking questions right at the end of the presentation. So our presenters are giving a joint presentation today. So please add your questions to the question tab as we go along through the webinar, and make sure you submit those by 12:50 just to make sure that we have enough time to get through as many as we can. Although there is a raise your hand button, we won't be using that. If you've got a question, like I said, just put it in the question tab and we'll come back to those at the end of the presentation. Just to let you know, today's presentation also has CPD points, so there's some information on the screen there for basis and also CPD points. Please email the admin@soils.org.uk if you want to register your CPD points with either of those organisations. And then finally, as you're probably aware, we are recording today's presentation, and it will be available on our YouTube channel soon after the webinar. So it's great. Thanks everybody for joining us, and I'd like to now introduce our presenters. And these are James Cooke and Dr. Peter Jones. So really excited to have representation from Wales at the webinar here today. So James leads the Peatland Soil and Agricultural Planning team in the Welsh Government, and he's been leading on the development of the National Peatland Action Programme. So this is one of the activities that his team is leading within the Welsh Government Soils team. But he has wider coverage of soils evidence, policy, and also technical advice, including running the Soil Policy Evidence Programme within the Welsh Government. He's currently involved in developing a soil policy statement for Wales, so I have my conflict here in my interest to be declared, so I've been helping the team to develop that along with James. And they also have quite a large remit of representing soils in the planning system, so in particular in terms of developments of national significance and also in mineral extraction cases as well. It's a really big remit for quite a compact team in the Welsh Gov. And on to Peter Jones. Dr. Peter Jones is a lead technical specialist for peatland ecosystems. So he's a specialist in peats and habitats, and he has particular expertise across Wales, in peatlands ecosystems in Wales, and he works for Natural Resources Wales. So as I said, Peter has significant experience, over 25 years working in peatlands in Wales. And this kind of remit covers a range of evidence within NRW, which includes policy support for the Welsh Government soil policy teams, but more specifically, things specifically on technical advice, utilising that experience, vast wealth of experience that Peter has in peatlands in Wales, particularly through developing strategic restoration topics. And of course, he's obviously feeding into the Welsh Government National Peatland Action Programme. So I'm really, really delighted to welcome you both, and really excited to hear about all of the work that's happening in Wales. We know about the importance of peatlands, not just as terrestrial carbon stores, but as significant habitats. So really excited to hear what you have to say about the programme. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Jack. And it's wonderful to be here to share the work that we're doing in Wales. So good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, maybe. I manage, as Jack said, I manage the Peatland Soil and Agricultural Land Use Planning Unit within the Department for Climate Change at Welsh Government. We're a small team of 2.6 full-time equivalents covering all the work that Jack said. So the National Peatland Action Programme, development and delivery, the soil policy statement, soil handling advice, and representing peatlands in the planning system and soils in the planning system. So we have a large casework element, everything from quarries to wind farms and everything in between. We also have a rolling programme of 3 to 6 month PhD placements and funding for a research fellowship position, which I'm proud to say Jack joined us on to develop the soil policy statement, and we're about to advertise for our second fellowship position over the next month or so. Responsibility for peatlands transferred to my team in 2018, where I met Peter Jones, and we began the journey of developing the National Peatland Action Programme across Wales. And before I introduce Pete, or ask Pete to introduce himself, I just wanted to go over the format for the session. So we've decided to do a double act rather than 2 separate presentations. And we'll begin with an overview of peatlands in Wales, their characteristics and distribution, before moving on to introduce the National Peatland Action Programme, policy development, and some of the challenges which we think, or we hope, may stimulate some of the discussion and questions towards the end of these slides. So if I can hand over to you, Pete, to begin the presentation.
Many thanks, James. And can I just check I'm coming across okay? Sound? Great.
You are,
yeah.
yes.
Thank you. Yeah, well, good afternoon, and many thanks to James and to Jack for the introduction there. I think you've actually covered all the essential details about me, but for those who don't know, Natural Resources Wales is the single integrated body responsible for environmental management and protection in Wales, and is Welsh Government's largest sponsored body. So we work very closely with the Welsh Government, and it's been a particular pleasure to work closely with James really over the last 3 to 4 years in getting this programme running. So to start with, really, how do we define peat soils in Wales? And we use, in fact, the original Soil Survey of England and Wales, the Avery 1980 definition, which is shown here. So more than 40 centimetres of organic material within the upper 0.8 meters, or where the profile is sitting directly on bedrock, more than 30 centimeters of organic material. If you could just click, sorry, James, just once. And this is all nicely explained actually in a piece of work which James funded and commissioned of Jack and of Caroline Key at Cranfield in their work to produce an updated map of the peatlands of Wales to support the development of the National Peatland Action Programme. But I think it's fair to say increasingly we try not to be overly influenced or limited by depth thresholds. And of course, these had a very pragmatic origin, reflecting the need really for clear rules when it came to soil type characterization and mapping, and those are important principles. But increasingly in Wales, because we have some very powerful legislation, which I think James will probably just run through in a moment, we try and take a kind of ecosystem orientated view of the conservation of our natural resources, and increasingly we appreciate the significance of thinner peats, particularly where these are contiguous with deeper peat profiles. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Next slide, please, James. So defined, peatlands amount to an area around about 82,200 hectares, or just under 4% of the terrestrial land area of Wales. And this is a fairly sort of conservative assessment based on a set of decision rules that are laid out in Caroline and Jack's report, which was on the previous slide, which were set up to ensure we only regarded an area as being peat if the underlying evidence met certain quality criteria. And looking at the distribution of soils, not surprisingly, the major concentration of peat soils, around about 3/4 of the resource, occurs along the upland spine of Wales, all the way from the Rhondda Valley and just south of that in South Wales, approximately around the Heads of the Valleys Road, right north up to almost the North Wales coast and the Carnarvon Mountains. But either side of that resource are very many expanses of peat, predominantly lowland peat, and this is really very important from a biodiversity and a carbon storage point of view. And really, wherever you are in Wales, you're never going to be terribly far away from a peatland site. Next slide, please, James. But reflecting what I just said, these deeper peat soils do, of course, sit within a much wider resource of shallow peat, shown here in various kind of shades of greeny grey. And that's a very much more extensive resource. And increasingly, we think that some at least of this organomineral resource is the product of degradation of originally deeper peat deposits that have been affected by past land use or even peat cutting. And again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more. Next slide, please. In fact, in this slide, which as far as we can tell, peat cutting for domestic fuel usage was more or less a ubiquitous activity in Wales. The more we look for evidence of peat cutting, the more we find. We, by and large, escaped the kind of mechanical stripping of peat, which has affected many peatlands elsewhere in the UK and in Europe. So most of the impact that we saw here was pretty much hand cutting, and the kind of prevalence of peat cutting may explain why the coverage of peat is perhaps rather less in Wales than we might expect, based on our generally, fairly wet climate and the widespread distribution of suitable topography for peat accumulation in the first place. And of course, much of the Welsh landscape was influenced by glaciation, and there's a lot of glaciogenic clay-rich material smeared across the Welsh landscape, upon which peat really ought to be there, but apparently as a deeper deposit isn't nowadays. Next slide, please, James. And next slide again, thank you. So that's covered a little bit about what peat is and where it occurs in Wales, but what of its ecological condition? And a sort of efficient way, really, of considering this is in viewing it as comprising 4 main elements, and the first of which is shown here in the top left. This is what we regard as the near natural peat resource. This is the least modified component of our peatlands. It comprises no more than 1/3 of the Welsh peatland resource and is the closest approximation we have to naturally functioning mires. And it's associated, and the numbers are shown here in the left-hand side, with either weak net emissions or indeed net sequestration, based on values published in the UK peatlands emissions inventory, the reference of which is shown there. And I think it's important to emphasise that even with the near natural resource, not all of that is in what we would regard as good ecological condition. Next click, please, James. Then we have, thank you. Then we have the modified component that's been damaged by drainage or historical peat cutting or a wide range of other factors. And straight away we can see that the greenhouse gas emissions from these surfaces shoots up. So these are definite kind of net emitters. Next click, please, James. Then we have woodland, of which an awful lot is plantation forestry on deep peat, which is emitting more again. And then finally, next click, we have our most heavily modified peatlands, by and large, these are no longer supporting semi-natural habitat and are often very deep drained, and these are kicking out really quite significant amounts of greenhouse gas equivalents. So I think from this slide we can see overall our peatland resource is not in the state we need it to be to support the characteristic biodiversity of peatlands, which includes many threatened habitats and species, nor indeed to perform the ecosystem services we now associate with healthy peatlands, notably the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions and of course carbon storage, as well as flood risk management and water quality benefits. So we had absolutely got to a point where we needed to address that, and I'll now hand back to James to give a bit of the context to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. And as Peter mentioned, there are two principal underpinning acts in Wales which drive pretty much everything we do, and those are the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and the Environment Act. The Environment Act places an enhanced duty on all public bodies to seek to maintain and enhance biodiversity in the exercise of their functions. So this provides the basis for how we consider the use of natural resources in Wales. The Wellbeing Act pushes the public sector to take a more joined up, long-term approach so that our decisions have a positive impact on the people living in the future as well as those living today. As policy and delivery teams, we must consider how each of the principles of these acts apply to the work that we're taking forward. So if we take here a resilient Wales, we need to ask, how do Welsh peatlands contribute to the resilience of the natural environment and the service and functions that we rely on? Are Wales peatlands resilient to climate change? And can they provide the regulating services and functions into the future for Wales and the wider UK? And we'll touch on this a little more in the challenges section. As Pete has already mentioned, we have perhaps 80 to 90,000 hectares of deep peat, so circa 4% of our land area, and a further 16% of organomineral soils. But we have a role to play globally in terms of protection of wetland habitats, water resources management, climate change, and the sustainable management of our finite soil resources in general. We're also thinking about how to use peat, and many of you will have seen the much trailed joint horticultural peat ban that's been undertaken with DEFRA. So despite at this time not having peatland extraction in Wales, is it responsible to be importing peat from elsewhere in Europe? We also have the ministerial ambition for peatlands, which is helping shape the thinking as part of our CAP or Common Agricultural Policy replacement. Once restored, how do we rehabilitate and manage these peatlands into the long term? The declared climate and nature emergencies in Wales inform programme development, but importantly, budget allocations, operational delivery and reporting. Peatlands is perhaps unique in that it addresses both the climate and nature emergencies with little controversy. GHG emissions is our current driver for targets, but the focus is broadening to think about how adaptation, carbon stocks and the just transition, so jobs and communities, are formally embedded in delivery and reporting. This slide, although complex, shows the web of strategies, plans and policies that touch on peatland delivery. The sheer number and their critical mass allow the focus and priority for peatland restoration to be maintained, hopefully over the long term. The strategic coordination of peatland delivery, policy and reporting across government is a significant challenge, and again something that we'll look at as the slides move forward. So Pete, if I can hand back over to you.
Very many thanks, James. Yeah, just to check you can hear me okay. Yeah, very good. Yeah, great. If you could just click again, please, that would be great. Great, thank you, that's perfect. So yeah, the fantastic platform of policy which James has just reviewed really gave us the ability to go forward in 2019 to 2020 in developing a national action programme for our peatlands in Wales, and this was published in 2020 and you can download it from NRW's website. The plan, in short, the two main components to it. First of all, it identifies the 6 priority action themes which represent the main context of peatland degradation in Wales and where intervention is needed most urgently to restore peatland biodiversity and the functionality that then results in terms of the provision of ecosystem services. And these include, there are no huge surprises here. Peatland erosion is of a relatively limited extent in Wales, but can be very severe where it occurs. We're fortunate in not having the kind of erosion we see in some parts of the Peak District, for example, but nonetheless, it is locally severe, and of course is predicted to intensify under climate change unless we kind of act now. And then there's peatland drainage, which is pretty extensive in Wales. There was a lot of capital-funded drainage schemes post-war, as well as some earlier drainage. Then we have topics around achieving the sustainable management of degraded lowland and upland peatlands, often including getting the right grazing onto sites. And then our last two priority action themes focus on the more heavily modified resource, the afforested peatlands, and then what we refer to as the hyper-modified resource. This is peatland that's really got pretty much no semi-natural habitat cover remaining. And we set the programme up for an initial 5-year period to kind of grow the programme organically as an NRW-led initiative, but with huge support from a wide range of partners across Wales. And as we move forward with the programme, we are going to, well, our intention is to pick up on the hyper-modified resource once we have the kind of tools really and resources to work collaboratively with land managers of those areas to identify the opportunities and challenges associated with restoring these sites. In parallel with the on-the-ground work, we've then got these three big cross-cutting themes which involve investing in the leadership role of the national programme in supporting and coordinating the collective efforts of our very many partners in Wales, including through grant aid, but also training in the use of best practice. We're also looking at building our a sort of national monitoring and restoration activity capture work, and we've gone most strongly so far in developing the activity capture element of this, with the monitoring element planned for the coming year or so, and then a major effort in increasing stakeholder and wider engagement in peatland restoration. And of course, just one more click please, James, this is all being supported through the fantastic work of James and colleagues in government in securing base funding of at least £1 million a year. So this is coming in as additional grant and aid to Natural Resources Wales to deliver this work in collaboration with partners. Next slide, please, James. So this is a little, if you could just click on through to get all the rest of it. Thank you very much. So impacts to date, well, we've been running for 3 full years now. The programme started in 2020, right at the height, if you remember, of the COVID SARS-19 pandemic, and our very first appointed colleague was Dr. Roswen Leonard, who's currently on maternity leave, but is our project manager. And then we've gone forward with appointing another 5 staff. So at the moment, it's a fairly discrete team of 6 core NRW staff, with me supporting, plus a wide range of other NRW staff, and of course the support of James and colleagues in government. And during this period and the subsequent years of the programme, we've been succeeded in delivering over 600 hectares of restoration activity per year, and the little icon in the top right hand picture shows the distribution of effort in the first year. To do this, we've had to set up a whole series of groundworks procurement mechanisms, including a direct delivery component that we do ourselves, plus land management agreements with partners, and large grant aid component with partners in Wales. In fact, 60% of our restoration activity is delivered in collaboration with partners. So there's been a sort of great sort of exponential rise in effort really to get us to this 600 hectare delivery point. And as we look to the future, we're hoping to expand on that. Next slide, please, James. So just to give you a flavour, really, of what this practically looks like, this is an example of a heavily eroded peatland site within the Welsh Government woodland estate. So this is owned by government and managed on government's behalf by NRW. And it's a before and after comparison of a piece of work to re-wet this eroded peatland by installing a wide range of peat dams and low contour bunds. And there's a blue dip well in the centre of the image on the left, and that's now nicely flooded as a result of all the hydrological restoration on the right. And we expect, based on published emissions values, for that to be accompanied by a decrease in CO2 emissions from the surface. And if you just click again, please, James. On a landscape scale, this is really quite spectacular. So that was a scene on the left with upstanding peat hags covered with woolly hair moss. That's the grey colour that you can see, with a lot of bare peat in between. Looking to the right, we've now substantially raised the overall water table across the site and hopefully stabilised it, and we would expect that now to colonise up with sphagnum and with cotton grass species. And obviously within the landscape, that is holding a great deal more water than the previous condition, and will have effectively shut off a lot of the loss of particulate peat to receiving water courses. I think I now hand back to James. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Pete. And that Pete provided a very good overview of the programme. So we've gone from policy commitments and drivers to the national programme to a point now where we have to look at that again and work out what do we need to deliver in order to hit our net zero commitment. So Pete and the team in Natural Resources of Wales led a piece of work to look at the range of condition types we have in Wales against the various emissions factors for those condition types, whether we had enough land in each of those condition types to achieve a net zero pathway for peatlands. And as part of that review, Pete and the team worked out they needed to increase delivery from something like 600 hectares per annum to 1,800 hectares per annum by about 2031. So in Wales, a piece of work or review came into place called the Biodiversity Deep Dive. And as part of that policy picture and embedding peatlands in strategic policy, the Biodiversity Deep Dive provided the perfect opportunity to review how our peatland delivery ambitions need to change for the future. So the Biodiversity Deep Dive itself provided a set of collective actions that we can take to support nature recovery, and it was set around the 30 by 30 target, where we need to protect and effectively manage at least 30% of our land, fresh water and sea for nature by 2030. And it's one of the number of targets that form part of the global biodiversity framework. So in numbers, by 2030-31, we need to move from 600 to 1,800 hectares of restored peatlands per annum. And this takes us from a budget of circa around £2 million per annum at the moment to £11 million per annum by that point, and from a core team of 7 staff including Pete to a staff of between 60 and 70 by that point. And I'm very much of the view that post-war landscape scale change was not achieved by just policy and commitments alone, but by the significant amount of government advisory services and technical officers that shaped that landscape scale change. And this is why an additional circa 60 staff are needed in Wales to drive the restoration and sustainable management at the pace we need to meet our nature and climate targets. However, this is a long-term plan through to 2050, and the first and probably most significant challenge for me is managing our funding within short-term budget settlements and against shocks and wider competing set of government priorities. So this is why it goes back to embedding peatlands within that wider underpinning policy environment is so important to galvanise that long-term thinking, priority and funding opportunity. One of those underpinning policies I just wanted to touch on, and it goes back to one of Pete's points about looking at peatlands as an ecosystem rather than just by a depth definition, is in future Wales's National Development Plan that sets out our strategic priorities and all planning and local government bodies need to take regard of. And this document is heavily influenced also by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the plan considers, under Policy 9, what are national natural resources, and some of those include biodiversity, carbon, natural flood management, habitat, all of which are underpinned by the presence of peat soils. And it goes further to require the consideration of the resilience of that ecosystem in development management decisions. So it's an extremely powerful document that ensures peatlands are given fair consideration, not only as a soil resource in their own right, but also as an ecosystem. However, whilst all that sounds very good, land use pressures remain. And I certainly, over my short career, have not known such intensity or pressure for land in Wales. Many of my colleagues feel the same way. And it's one thing to have peatlands embedded in policy, but it still requires that policy to be represented by government. And this forms a significant part of our role. So this really takes us to our second challenge, is how do we balance competing land use pressures and disputed evidence? How do we develop our evidence base? And how do we avoid the salami slicing of the resource in arguments over significance and carbon balances when we talk about competing land use pressures? Part of that answer is, we hope, in the development of a soil policy statement for Wales, which Jack mentioned at the start of this, to help ensure not just peats, but all soils are taken into account of at the earliest possible point in the decision-making process for government and its agencies. And the other is access to information. How do we make peat and soil information as accessible as possible? Part of that response is the development of a peatland data portal, which has been published, and we can share the links with you for that. I'll bring in Pete a little later to talk more about the portal and its development and how it's moving forward. But the first step for us was in collating all the available peatland data and creating an openly available peatland base map for the country. It's not perfect by any means, but it is a living map with the intention to be periodically updated as restoration takes place in Wales and our knowledge of individual peatland bodies improves. Cranfield University developed the Peatlands of Wales map series for us, and it takes available and previously unpublished soil survey, WG, NRW, BGS and other partner data to create a basic 3D map of Wales's peatlands on a 50-metre grid approach based on the Avery definition that Peter went over earlier. And Pete's already shown you the extent map, but there's also this evidence layer which you mentioned, and it shows the maximum possible area according to all data sources. But unless it scores 2 or more, it won't appear and draw through into that extent map. And what I mean by this is that peat may well be on, for example, the BGS superficial geology maps, but unless there is another data source such as point survey data, that doesn't pull through. However, it does allow for the prioritisation of site investigations and targeting, and this base map is also available. So that the tan image on your map in front of you that scores 1, that is where we think peatlands might be, but we have no evidence to support peatland is actually there. But with an evidence score of 2 to 9, so your pinks and reds, we have got supporting evidence that peat has been found or is known to be in that particular location. The map also provides either an estimated or actual depth for that 50-metre peat cell. So you can see here the shallower areas in yellow to the deeper areas up to nearly 10 metres deep in purple. And the blocky squares in the purple and black, they represent where we've got actual survey data. But where you've got the yellow and orangey colours, those show standard profile descriptions, which we'll come back onto. And then we go through into emissions. This is important because part of the funding and policy reporting, we need to be able to report not just on hectares restored, but also on other outcomes we're hoping to achieve for decarbonisation, biodiversity and water. And these maps provide the starting point for doing that. It's also important so we can assess that we're restoring the correct areas. We may meet our per annum hectare target, but are we actually meeting our emissions targets that we've been set? So before I bring Pete in to say a little bit more about the activity reporting developments through the Peatland Data Portal, I just wanted to mention the challenges in mapping. So inform restoration, outcome reporting, planning advice and land use decisions, we need to know where our peat resource is, its condition and how much of it we have. We're not convinced entirely by some of the depth slope model calculations to estimate peat depth. So we've all opted for actual depths where we have observed measurements. And where we don't have observed measurements, as I said, we use standard soil series descriptions. So just bring up the depth map again. You've got these intense pockets in the purples where we've got actual measurements recorded or actual depths recorded. But then we've got these larger bands of yellow and orange or reddy orange that really show the profile, standard profile description. So 40 centimetres for the yellow and 1 metre for the reddy orange. And in hindsight, I'd wish we'd included these less than 40 centimetre transitioning peats to represent that wider peatland body and ecosystem that Pete mentioned earlier on in this conversation, because the artificial cutoff is not helpful in actual delivery terms and representing peatlands in on the ground in development managed decisions or other land use competition contexts. So, an open question as part of this challenge is, are there other ways or new techniques to estimate extent and depth across peatland bodies without the need for systematic surveys? And also, how do we report on wider outcomes for water and biodiversity within this mapping framework? ONS estimate that 7% of the UK's drinking water comes from upland areas, for example. So how do we represent these services for Welsh peatlands? So I think I'll just leave that there, and perhaps Pete can come in now and talk a little bit about the Peatland Data Portal and some of the reporting that we hope to take forward.
Thank you very much, James. Yeah, no, that's some fantastic mapping there. And I mean, just in terms of reporting, it's obviously very important that we are able to feed back to James on the outcome really of Welsh Government's massive investment in peatland restoration. And our approach to this is divided into two main strands. Firstly, reporting on the restoration activity actually delivered in terms of hectares of land, hectares of peatland now placed on a recovery pathway. And then there's the reporting on the actual outcome of restoration in relation to our two main programme drivers. And these are really biodiversity recovery and then the better adaptation of the Welsh peat resource to the pressures of climate change. And then, of course, reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that we expect to be associated with this restoration work. In terms of the latter, we're still working on a kind of ecological and ecosystem service outcome monitoring methodology. We've got parts of it in place, parts of it being trialled. In terms of the former, in terms of the activity reporting, we're more or less there with that now, I think. So a colleague of ours on the Peatland Programme, Dr. Esther Clues, has led on the development of a standardised GIS-based system for recording a wide range of different restoration activity types, and we have getting on for 100 of these in our kind of restoration activity library, for want of a better word. And for each of these, we've assigned a standard buffer which reflects the zone over which beneficial change, mostly hydrological change, is expected to occur as a result of the restoration activity. So taking the top left-hand image here as an example, in the case of gully blocking on an eroded peatland, we're taking a radius of rewetting of 30 metres, and we've adopted existing metrics where these exist, for example, in the peatland code, and we will in time be able to change the buffer values as the evidence base develops, without actually affecting the underlying digitised data concerning where restoration has been done. And so we're asking all our funded partners to submit their restoration activity information in a form compatible with this, so that we can report in a kind of coherent, sensible way back to government and back to all our other partners on a kind of annual basis, and that will all be through our peat portal, which is an online resource accessible through NRW's website. Next slide, please, James. So just to continue really on the theme of challenges, which James was talking about, and there have been some really quite amazing advances in our evidence base. When my career in peatland conservation science began, 25 odd years ago, the primary motivation for peatland restoration was as a biodiversity recovery measure. But in those 25 years, if one plotted a graph of published papers, there are three huge influences that have driven a vast increase in studies, the biggest of which is the significance of peatlands in terms of climate change mitigation, and the whole literature around the carbon and greenhouse gas benefits of peatlands is now enormous and actually quite difficult for any individual to keep track of. But despite all that, there are some quite significant gaps, and we've just popped up two here as an example, so they're really quite relevant in a Welsh context. The first being developing a better understanding of the greenhouse gas and carbon balance benefits of restoring forested peatlands in higher yield contexts. I think there's probably a broad consensus that restoring peatland in lower yield class contexts is a very sensible thing to do for peatland restoration and for greenhouse gas mitigation benefits. The science seems to be a little less clear in areas of really high productive forestry, and that is an area where we urgently need better information, I would argue. And then the other area is where we could really do with much better tier 2 or even tier 3 emissions factors for gas flux from other peatland surfaces, which are very prevalent in a Welsh context. And in our particular case, that would be millennia dominated peatlands in the bottom right. We think we've got 25,000 hectares of this altogether in Wales, and we really do need a much better handle on how that might be influenced by rewetting and by other surface management. Next slide, please, James. Then in terms of other challenges, we of course have the change which climate change which is already underway and that which is predicted will have on the restorability of peatland surfaces. And this is a very neat piece of modelling that Dr. Gemma Bell did under another contract that James and colleagues ran in Welsh Government, which looked at the overall suitability of degraded precursors for restoration back to blanket bog. And as the colours go yellow or even worse grey, that's a measure of how much progressively harder it is expected to become to restore blanket bog in this particular case. And there are some quite obvious changes between the two maps, and it kind of underlines that there is a time imperative associated with all this restoration activity. We really cannot afford to kind of hang around. Next slide, please. Then there are the challenges of us rising to the sort of to the challenge of the global biodiversity framework. And James mentioned the 30 by 30 targets, and they are articulated here in full. That by 2030, in just 7 years' time, we need to be aiming to get a third of our degraded ecosystems under effective restoration. I think we'll be getting pretty close to that for the peatland resource by that time. The GBF3 target, we're actually already somewhat in excess of that, because the protected sites network in Wales covers almost 52% of the peatland resource. And interesting to note that this is entirely on biological biodiversity criteria. Next slide, please, James. Then there are the very practical challenges posed by the availability of suitably skilled contractors with the right equipment to undertake peat restoration. And this may well have been our main on-the-ground challenge at the beginning of the peat restoration programme, in that contractor availability is already rate limiting in this field. We and our partners in Wales are finding that, and our partners elsewhere in the UK are also finding that. So as we look forward to an expanded programme of restoration, we have in mind various measures to try and promote the capacity and capability of contractors in this sector. Next slide, please. And then, of course, once peatland surfaces have been restored, once we've done all the obvious kind of capital, if I can put it, restoration activities, how do we then ensure that investment is retained in future decades? And in doing that, it's vital we work closely with our land management partners, obviously the farming community at the very top of that, in achieving that, and in so doing ensure we both understand and respond to the challenges they face in grazing what are often quite challenging sites to restore. And so in doing that, we're working hard to, as part of that I should say, we're working hard to ensure that future agri-environment support in Wales is closely integrated with the work that the National Peatland Action Programme is doing. And I think I hand back to James at this point. Thank you, James.
Thank you, Pete. So I thought we'd just quickly, before we draw to a close, just summarise the challenges that we've identified here. For me, from a delivery policy perspective, mapping, reporting, emissions and the driver for delivery are really important, because they underpin our ability to respond to the challenges relating to funding, policy integration and delivery. I think that there probably there's one challenge that's not on here potentially, which is managing expectations around the practical reality of delivery on the ground against some of the targets and ambitions that we're committed to, or various interests want us to be committed to. So there's always that element of delivery realism or practicability around this. But also, just in terms of what is the main driver, I've talked about decarbonisation quite a bit as being our main delivery driver through to net 50. But Pete showed in his slides the piece of work by Dr. Gemma Bell around can these ecosystems function in a changing climate moving forward, given that they are in a pretty degraded state at the moment. What should our driver be? Should that driver be decarbonisation or adaptation? Because adaptation potentially looks a lot different to the decarbonisation pathway. And just to finish, none of this can be achieved without all our partners. Pete said that an awful lot of the national programme is actually delivered by partners if administered by NRW. So all these wonderful partners are part of that practical reality of delivery, because of, land is managed and owned by private party and interests across the country. The Welsh Government public estate only encompasses perhaps 10% or maybe even 15% of the total peatland area. So we need our partners to come with us on this journey to be able to deliver at the scale and pace that we need. And thank you very much to Pete, and thank you very much to all of you for listening.
That's brilliant. Thank you both, to James and Peter, for a really fascinating talk there. Just how complicated it is, sort of integrating, setting policy ambition and actually delivering your really impressive, actually an ambitious programme on the ground. So it's really good to see some of those outcomes being realised already. And also always really good to sort of finish on the challenges there. There are many of them as well, competing land uses and biodiversity targets, as well as, making sure that we're adapting to climate change. So yeah, that's great. We've got a few minutes just for some questions. So we've got some through. So I'm just going to field those. So feel free to decide who wants to answer these. There's some on forestry. One person's picking up on which is quite an interesting issue, because you talked about these shallow peat soils. So how would you plan, this is another challenge, I guess, to overcome the issue of sort of afforested peatlands when the Woodland Carbon Code still allows for carbon credits to be generated on plantations on peat that's shallower than the cutoff that you talked about? I don't know who wants to answer that one, maybe Peter or first, and James, if you both, yeah.
Yeah, no, very happy to. Yeah, and so we're in a very fortunate position, really, in Natural Resources Wales, in that we obviously perform all the functions of the former Forestry Commission. So in setting up this national programme, we were able to work very closely with forestry colleagues and agree what's proved to be a very successful approach, really, which is working through the forest resource planning process. We're identifying both open ground and formerly afforested peatland sites to restore. And what we've opted to do in that is to focus on the lower yield class contexts where tree growth hasn't been that good. So well, certainly the chances of restoring a functional peatland surface obviously a bit more immediate and promising, and that's where we're going, and that's opening up a lot of formerly afforested land for restoration as we go forward.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we do have the EIA forestry regs, which NRW administer as well, which need to consider the use of soils as part of that administration. But in terms of government, my team sit in the same division as the Forest Policy Division as well. Mm-hmm. So we also sit in the same division as the EIA Agriculture Regulation team, a number of other landscape scale delivery teams. So we have a very good working relationship in trying to resolve some of these issues. The sustainable, we have a national resources policy statement for Wales that helps shape it, and we've also got the sustainable management of natural resources, which the way you approach natural resources is specified. I think it's in the Environment Act as well. So there's a policy framework around trying to think about some of these competing issues, land use pressures, which I talked about quite a bit. But it does mean that you've got to maintain and develop those relationships with each of those teams to ensure that there aren't policy surprises or delivery surprises as a result of a decision taken in isolation.
Yeah. It's just making sure there's no unintended consequence, isn't there, across there. I guess there's hopefully a short sort of follow-up question on the forestry, which was about, talking about the potential for restoration there, Peter. I guess is that, are there, this may be an evidence question. I think you probably covered it in the talk. So what is the potential for restoration on those sites where there's been significant disturbance through the forestry operations, for example? Do you know, or is that an evidence question? I guess is the question.
No,
so
I think it is. There is a definite evidence element to that, and we are in contact with colleagues elsewhere in the UK, particularly Forestlands, Scotland, to kind of understand some of the factors that ultimately influence the success of restoration. I mean, we're applying quite a wide range of techniques, and the range of techniques has there's been quite a lot of development of this, really, even in the last 5 years. So and we've tackled some pretty initially unpromising sites in terms of restoration, and that the signs are initially good. An issue comes with the extent to which these surfaces are prone to kind of then seeding up with conifer seeds around the edge. So I think our feeling is that on a large scale in the future, this idea of wholly removing all tree cover before you start restoration, we're going to have to be a bit more pragmatic than that, and maybe certainly tolerate broad-leaved cover within the context of a re-wetted peatland surface on these upland and upland margins. So some interesting questions there, actually, and there are groups of researchers around the country who are really quite interested in looking at that.
Yeah,
I think for us it's quite an exciting time, because we've got this upscale plan that we are now putting into place with the increasing staff. Formerly, that would just rest on Pete's shoulders, as well as all the work you have to do on day-to-day delivery as well. But as the team get bigger, there is more opportunity, as we've proved already with engagement with our forestry colleagues, our forest research colleagues, as well as your members and the wider academic community, on addressing some of these evidence questions and for longer term research moving forward. So so it's quite an exciting time, because we just haven't had the capacity in Welsh Government to do that to date.
No, I think that's a really important point, actually, to think about. Our members provide quite a lot, not just through directed programmes from you, but through other research programmes that they're undertaking, and that really good to get that evidence into policy. So we have loads of more questions, but we do have to unfortunately wind up the webinar now. There was a few about lowland peats as well, but unfortunately we don't have time to answer those. But again, just to express our thanks, thank you very much to James and Peter for your presentation today. Really fascinating, it sparked lots of discussion. And thank you everybody else for attending. And for those of you that are able to stay on for the next session, we have our annual general meeting, and this will start shortly. If you're not staying for the AGM and leaving us, you will find a quick feedback survey when you leave the webinar. So please do take time to complete that. We do gather that information to try to improve some of the webinars and the topics and things going forward. So it's really important to receive your feedback. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is being recorded, and a video of the webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. So do check there if you want to go over anything. We're going to have a short break in the summer for our webinar series, and so the next one will be scheduled for Wednesday, the 6th of September. So do put that date in your diary, and just do check the BSQ website for further information in due course. So I'd like to thank you, and there we go. There's the website link at the bottom there. You can check the events for the next topic of our Zoom into Soil.